You know, when you start a study like this, there's so many things that you want to bring up, you want to talk about and deal with. One of the things that I'm not going to do in the study is I'm not going to be presumptuous enough to tell you what every horn and every toenail represents that we see in the book of Revelation. I'm not qualified to do that, and frankly, some of these guys who do it are not qualified to do it. But I'm going to do the very best that I can to make sense of the book. Mike and I will, in teaching it and trying to give us a good handle as to what is going on. And one of the things that what we need to do in our study is try to transport ourselves back in time. What we need to do is view this book, if we possibly can, perhaps with the same attitude that the early Christians had when they received the book. One of the things that I realized in studying the book of Revelation is I don't believe that the early Christians received it and handled it quite like we do. I cannot imagine, let's say one of the, it was a circular writing, and what I mean by that, it was sent to various churches, and it was intended to be read by this church and passed on to this church and passed on to this church. And I cannot imagine, let's say, one of the elders at the church at Thyatira getting the letter after it was finally given to that church and getting up before the congregation and saying, now we got this letter, we got this writing, we got this revelation from John. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read it. And so he begins to read it to the congregation, and he gets through about a chapter, and he said, well, now we'll stop right here and we'll pick up again next week. I don't believe they did that. I believe they read it through in its entirety, and I believe it was something that those early Christians could grasp. I think it's something that they appreciated. I think it was something that benefited them a great deal. And so what we need to do is in some kind of way, and that's what these first few lessons are going to be about, to try to help us transport ourselves back and then begin to view the book perhaps the way that they viewed the book when it was first given to them. Now, one of the things that I ask you to do, for those of you who were here Sunday, and we had very few of you here Sunday, by the way, but those of you who were here Sunday, we ask you to sit down and read the 22 chapters of the book of Revelation prior to coming to class in one or two settings. Did anybody do that? Okay, had a lot of people to do that. Well, let me ask you, those of you who did and those of you who are willing to comment, tell me what were some of your impressions, having just read the book, not with commentaries, not with dictionaries, but just reading the book. What were some of your observations? Sue, what were some of your observations?
Well, one thing I noticed is that as Jesus described himself to all the seven churches, each description was different.
To each of the churches. But the interesting thing about that is his description to the churches in chapters 2 and 3 are related to what John saw in chapter 1 in a lot of regards. And so a lot of that imagery is then seen with the various churches. And you're right. The image is different as he would speak to the churches. Bill, what was your observation?
Well, unless I read it wrong, that particular writing, there was a nighttime in heaven. Did I read it wrong?
No, you read it right.
I mean, that was something that came out that I had never thought about before because I read it several times.
Okay. Karen, what about you?
Well, I just, how today people want to make it for our time or in the future, and he said that this thing was going to be now or shortly come to pass.
Okay, so that's the thing that impressed you. Kyle, what about you?
The same things, things that they would be experiencing is gone after necessarily something like that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Richard.
What a great reward we got to look forward to.
Say again?
What a great reward we got to look forward to.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. What are some of the images that are portrayed in the book that tended to stand out to you or maybe arrest your attention right away? Bill?
All the eyes on some of those people.
Okay, the eyes.
They got eyes
As a matter of fact, eyes on the lamb that was slain, 7 eyes, 7 horns. Yeah, see.
Probably the fact that they had a lot of heads too on the beast.
Okay, a lot of heads, a lot of horns.
Different kinds of heads too.
There's different kinds of heads. A leopard, a man, an eagle. Sam?
What I liked about it was that Jesus was at every one of those churches at one time. And so he was omnipresent and he saw everything. So it might be different over here, but he was there too at the other ones.
Okay.
So
What does that tell you then about Jesus if he is with every one of those churches and you speak of the omnipresence of Christ?
he's there, he's in command, and he gives direction to each one of them at the same time.
And some of the things that we talk about Sunday, we're dealing with God here, dealing with He who was dead, He's alive, and He's alive evermore. David?
One of the things that's always impressed me is the throne scene in heaven depicted in chapter 4. There's a lot of detail there, and there's just a whole lot of heavenly hosts. And I saw a picture that a Christian drew just reading what was there and trying to put all that in. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So,
One thing that I noticed that I thought was really odd was in chapter 1 and verse 7 when he's saying that even the ones who pierced him, it's like God drew that in to that little spot. Verse 1 and verse 7. Behold, he's coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even the ones who pierced him.
anybody over here got any? Kyle, you got anything that jumped out at you as far as the imagery?
Well, one of the things when you read and you like go through the 7 roles and the plagues that go with those, it kind of took me back to Exodus and the reaction of the people. It says they blasphemed God and did not heed his words, and that took me back to Pharaoh. And all that stuff, Pharaoh hardened his heart and let the people go.
Okay, very good. And I'm glad you brought up Exodus. Did anyone else make any connection between anything that's in this book and maybe some imagery from the Old Testament? Sharon?
Moses, when he turned the water to blood, and Elijah, when he stopped the rain. There was something in there. There's something about the prophets.
It is no accident that there is a lot of Old Testament imagery that's found in the book of Revelation. No accident at all. Especially when we get into the type of writing that this is, you'll see why that imagery is the same. But here's a couple of things about that. There are no direct quotations. Even though there are more than 400 allusions to the Old Testament, there are, if I'm correct about it, and I think that I am, there are no absolute quotations. Now there's some similarities and some sort of paraphrases that seem as to be direct quotations, but they're not. And another thing, just because there are similarities, and just because some of the imagery in the book of Revelation is also seen in the Old Testament, the imagery as it applied in the Old Testament is not applied to the same thing in the book of Revelation. John is using that imagery and making his own application. And so while we may be able to look, let's say, in the book of Ezekiel or in the book of Zechariah, and we may be able to see some of the similar imagery, Ezekiel and Zechariah are not referencing the same thing that John is, even though the imagery is going to be very similar or even the same. Richard?
Saints represented the Old Testament and the New Testament, same manner and alive and
Well, that's right. That's right. David?
Well, John starts off in the very first verse talking about, things that were signified or communicated, depending on the translation you're looking at. But, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his bondservants the things which must shortly take place, which he sent and signified it by his angel to the bondservant John. So he starts off indicating there are signs here. And you're right, there's lots of allusions to the Old Testament and signs in the Old Testament that he refers to here. And so he tells us right up front, there's a lot of figurative language here.
Yeah, and really there are a couple of things, and David's absolutely right about that, and that's something we mustn't lose sight of. Because when we approach the book of Revelation, we do approach it somewhat differently than we do, some other books in the Bible, because it tells us right up front. In other words, the word that's used to translate the word revelation reminds us of something that's very important. We'll get into that in a moment. But it also tells you, as David pointed out, that it's written in symbolism. So John tells us right up front, these are symbols, these are signs. And so it's as a lot of people say, the best way to read the book of Revelation is to see the pictures, to see the signs. It's more like a mural than it is a scroll of information doctrinally. You know, we can look at the book of Acts and we see a history of the establishment of the church, and that translates well into a book. The book of Revelation is somewhat different than that. It's more like pictures that are seen, that represent something that those Christians could immediately relate to and understand because of their background and because of the type of language that's used in the book of Revelation. Now I'm going to run through some slides here for just a moment, because what I want us to do is kind of get a visual of what it was that was occurring at this time. The Apostle John, and I'm not going to emphasize a great deal of whether it was the Apostle John who was the author of the book of Revelation. There are some people who want to take issue with everything. There are some who deny that it was the Apostle John. I think the evidence is, I think it's in, so I'm not even going to spend time proving that. This is the Apostle John, the last living apostle of Jesus. And he has been banished to a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea, Patmos. Now, Patmos was a place of exile, much like we could think about the French, Devil's Island. It's where people were exiled. Political prisoners, degenerates, people that you just wanted to get out of society. John was put on there, and a lot of people seem to think that what was happening to those who were exiled, they were there to work the mines. And whether that's true or not, we simply don't know. John doesn't mention that. But John is exiled to the island of Patmos. While he is there on the island of Patmos, he receives this vision. And that's exactly what it is. He was shown a vision. Now, he was told to write down his vision. And he was told where to send that vision. And he did exactly what the Lord intended him to do. Now, did John smuggle that writing off of the island of Patmos? Or did he take it with him after he was released and went back to Ephesus? And again, we don't know. Probably the latter. But we simply don't know. But this is what I want you to see. John is on the island of Patmos, and he receives this vision. He hears someone talking to him, and he turns around. He said he's in the Spirit on the Lord's Day when he receives this vision. Now, a couple of things about that we could point out. Is the Lord's Day the first day of the week? Or is the Lord's Day, the way it was used in the Old Testament, the day of the Lord, that is when God was intervening? We don't know. But he was in the Spirit, that is, he was in a frame of mind to receive a vision. And he hears this voice talking to him. He turns around and he sees the risen Christ standing among 7 lampstands. And he describes the apparel that Jesus has on. And he points out that Jesus has a sword that is protruding from his mouth. And he's told by Jesus to write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall come to pass. That's verse 19. I think that's chapter 1, verse 19. I think that is a good outline of the book. The things that John had just seen is the vision of Jesus in chapter 1. The condition of the way things are is the condition of the 7 churches of Asia in chapters 2 and 3. And so those are, the first 3 chapters of Revelation often doesn't give people a lot of pause. It's when you get into the rest of the book, the things that are going to happen after this. So, after he sees this vision of the Lord, he is then told, after these things, he says, after these things I looked, and behold a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking to me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you the things which must take place after that. And then we get this big panorama of events that begin to transpire. First thing that John observes is he sees, as David pointed out a moment ago, he sees this magnificent scene of God sitting on His throne. And he sees around the throne 24 elders. He sees living creatures. He describes this throne scene, just the magnificence of it. And while he's looking at this throne scene, he sees that the one sitting on the throne had a scroll. And it was sealed with 7 seals. And he was looking for somebody to open that scroll. Now that scroll is going to reveal the things that must take place after this. But nobody can open the scroll. There's nobody in heaven. There's nobody on earth. There's nobody under the earth that can open this scroll and to read the contents. This disturbs John. And John begins to cry. And he's told, now don't cry, because there is one worthy to open the scroll and to reveal its contents. And the one, of course, who is worthy to open that is the Lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes that had been slain. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, of course, in reference to the conquering Christ. Christ is able to open this throne, or open this scroll and read the contents. And everybody began to rejoice. They sang a new song saying, "You're worthy to take the scroll and open its seals. For you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and have made us to be kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth." And then the scenes just keep coming. When the seals are begin to be broken and open, things happen. You get these 4 horsemen come. The first horse is a white horse, and the rider has a bow. Then we see a red horse, and then we see a black horse with, and then a pale horse with death riding there, and Hades following in behind. So these are things that John begins to see, and these are things that we observe as we read through the book. We get over to chapter 6, and we're going to see when the 5th seal is opened, we're going to see a bunch of people that's under the altar. And they're crying out, "How long are we going to be here till you avenge our blood of those upon the earth? How long?" And they were given white robes, and they were told, "You wait a little while. And till, there's some more people are going to die, so you just hold on till all of this happens to, your fellow servants. They're going to be killed." And indeed, that's certainly going to take place. You get over to chapter 7, and you're going to see 144,000 are sealed, receiving seals on their head. And these are things that John is observing. Then there are 7 angels with 7 trumpets, and they're going to sound those trumpets, and something's going to happen after each trumpet is sounded. And then an angel, it's a big, magnificent, mighty angel, dressed in, like a rainbow, comes down and has a little small scroll in his hand. And he gives that to John. Does anybody know what John does with it? He eats it. He eats the scroll. Then John, in chapter 12, he sees a woman in heaven. A woman who's expecting a baby. And he sees a dragon, a terrible dragon that's waiting to devour the child that she delivers. And the dragon has a tail that's able to knock the stars out of heaven. Then he sees this horrible creature come out of the sea. And he describes what he sees coming up out of the sea, this creature that's coming out. And you got to look at this thing as a miracle. All of these things are what John has been revealed. Then he sees the 7 bowls of wrath that are poured out upon the earth, and terrible things happen when these bowls of wrath are poured out on the earth. And then he sees a woman, a scarlet woman that's on a scarlet beast. And this woman is drunk with the blood of Christians. And then she has a writing on her head that says, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. And then we see how Babylon has fallen. And God says, come out of her to His people. And then we see Jesus in chapter 19 leading a mighty army coming down on a white horse, and the host of heaven dressed in white that are following Him for this great battle that's going to take place. Then John sees in chapter 20 the old dragon, the serpent, the devil, just sucked into a bottomless pit and bound. And then John moves from that to see the great white throne of judgment. And all people standing before that great white throne of judgment. John sees that those who were not found written in the book of life were cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. And then John sees the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And so that just kind of gives us a panoramic view of the things that John has seen and the things that we're going to be studying about in the class. And I hope I did it in a way that kind of whets your appetite. Don't you want to get into this? You kind of try to see what's going on here, see what's happening here, and why these things are revealed in the way that they are. But I got a question for you. Is it actually possible to understand the book of Revelation? Is it possible to understand all of those symbols and all of that we just looked at? Is that possible? You know, I want you to notice something. In chapter 1 and verse 3, the Bible says, Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. That verse indicates to us in dramatic fashion that the book was intended not only to be read, but it was to be understood, and it was to be kept. It was to be obeyed. Now, the interesting thing about the book of Revelation is the type of writing that it is. And I'm not going to deal with that a great deal right now. I'll get into that in a moment. But it's actually a revelation. It's actually a prophecy. And it's actually epistles. It's the epistles that are sent to the 7 churches. It's a book of prophecy, keeping the words of this prophecy. And then it is a revealing of the things that are going to shortly take place. So it's a real interesting book in and of itself and the composition of it. Now, if verse 3 indicates that it's to be read, and by the way, is it one of the books that you read most often? No. And I think all of us can say that. But it's to be read, but it's also to be kept. It's to be understood. What do you think is the reason why that the book of Revelation probably is at the top of the list of misunderstood books in the Bible? Why do you think that is? No right and wrong answer. I'm just kind of probing you to see what your observations might be, David.
Oh, because it's written in signs and symbols, it kind of opens itself up to lots of different interpretations. In that way, it's not as straightforward as most books of the Bible. And there was a very good reason, I think, for that. Because the true meaning was meant to be hidden to those that would be persecuted Christians at that time. And
which is an interesting paradox. It was shielding, but it was revealing. So that poses a paradox. The other day, in the back.
I think a lot of times people come into a study of the book of Revelation with an idea that they want to try to make this fit. Because of the symbols that are in it, the figurative language, they can twist bits and pieces of it to fit the ideas and the teachings that they're trying to make it fit. So you see now these pictures over here, they fit what I was trying to teach all along.
Yeah. It's just like we said on the worksheet. the book of Revelation has become a virtual playground for sensationalists who see modern fulfillment of the book in actual events occurring in the Middle East. And so a lot of people want to read the book of Revelation as though what is occurring with ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, all of this is a fulfillment of events that are occurring in the book of Revelation. And when the book of Revelation is treated in that kind of way, I think it's like Brother Fisher was pointing out, it just becomes open to just various interpretations, and sometimes wild speculation. A man by the name of Hal Lindsey, who had written several books, he was a premillennialist in the 70s. One of the books that he wrote is There's a New World Coming, a Prophetic Odyssey. And on page 298 of that book, he says, now to the skeptic who says that Christ is not coming soon, I would ask him to put the book of Revelation in one hand and the daily newspaper in the other, and then sincerely ask God to show him where we are on his prophetic clock. But that's not what the book of Revelation is about. The book of Revelation has absolutely no bearing upon events that are taking place either in Russia or in the European market or in the Middle East. You have to put this thing in context. You have to put the book in context with the first century, when it was written and for the purpose that it was written. Yeah?
Verse 1 says that these things are shortly to come to pass.
Yeah. And that word shortly to come to pass, the beginning of all of these things to come was going to start just immediately. It would take a little while for all of these things to be fulfilled, but it is possible to understand the book of Revelation. Now, here's what we need to do when we approach the book of Revelation. We have to recognize that there are various interpretations that people place on it. There's the interpretation that's known as the futurist view. And that's what Hal Lindsey and others like him view the book. This view is the traditional premillennial view. It usually takes the figurative and makes it literal. And on the other hand, it makes the literal figurative. For example, what they do is they see the 7 churches of Revelation 2 and 3 not as literal churches. Not as the church at Ephesus, and the church at Sardis, and the church at Laodicea. Not literal churches with memberships and elderships and work and worship. They see these as various church ages. They see, for example, the church at Ephesus, that represents the age of love, the church age of love. And the church at Laodicea, that's the age of church apathy. And that's the age they say that we're in now. And so they see church ages here rather than churches. But on the other hand, they see the beasts and the mark 666. They see that as literal. And so that's the futurist view. Another view is the continuous historical view. Now, that's a view that used to be very, very common among members of the church. John Hines, a commentator, I believe it's Hines, I can't remember if that's his first name or not, a commentary that I have on the book of Revelation in the Gospel Advocate series, teaches this. The continuous historical view is the view that accepts the book as a forecast of church history from John's day until the end of the world. This view sees the rise of the papacy, the Pope, the Roman Catholic Church, Islam, the Reformation movement, the Restoration movement. Now these people are usually saying that, well, now, we're right here. Now, right here today that we're living, we're right here in chapter 19 of the book of Acts. That's 19 of the book of Revelation. That describes us. That's the continuous historical view, really just an overview of church history. Then there's the preterist view. This view says that all the events pictured were fulfilled in John's day, and other than revealing those events to us, the book has no modern value. And this view sees the book applying to the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 A.D. That's the preterist view. That word just simply means fulfilled, and they're saying that all of these things have been fulfilled. Then there is the historical background view. This view sees the persecuting forces as Rome, and the book is revealing that God is in control and that Christ will defeat the devil and his ally, Rome, and the suffering saints will be victorious. That, I believe, is the correct view that one is to approach the book of Revelation with. That's keeping it in the historical context, and that's making those figures and those signs and those symbols applicable to the first century, applicable to those people. They understood, and they knew what they were going through, and that they needed that encouragement that they would eventually be victorious. There are three things that we need to keep in mind if we're going to have a good understanding of the book of Revelation. We're going to have to, number one, we're going to have to understand the time that the book was written. Then we'll have to understand the people to whom it was written. And then we have to understand the kind of language in which it was written. Now, let's learn of the time the book was written. I believe the evidence is overwhelming that it was written during the reign of Emperor Domitian, near the end of his reign, sometime in the years 95 or 96 A.D., placing it as the last of the writings, canonical, accepted canon writings. That's when I believe that the book, and that's the approach that this study is going to have. Now, I realize that there are several views pertaining to the date of the writing of the book of Revelation and to what it applies. And I've read volumes. Two of our brethren who have advocated over the years the early date and the application of the destruction of Jerusalem have been Foye Wallace and Arthur Ogden. And I've read both of those commentaries, and I've read, actually I even got to read the manuscript of Brother Ogden's commentary before it was ever printed. And, you know, and they make some good arguments. They do. There's good arguments to be made for the early date. I just simply have not been persuaded by that, and that's the reason that this approach is going to take, not during the reign of Nero, but during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. I think that fits better with the context, and I'll show you why in just a moment. To do that, let me go back to a prophecy in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Daniel is a book, parts of Daniel is a book that's written very similar in style to the book of Revelation. And now you remember, in Daniel 2, we're all familiar with Daniel 2 and the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, somebody just give me a brief synopsis of this great image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. What was represented by the head and the breast and the loins and the feet of that image in Daniel chapter 2? What was represented there? Okay?
4 kingdoms.
Which were?
Starting with the kingdom of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar being the head, then the Medo-Persian Empire, then the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, and finally the Roman Empire.
Okay. And what was going to happen in the days of the Roman Empire is that
God would establish his
God would establish his kingdom, and that kingdom would prevail, would remain, you see. But now, when you get over into chapter 7 of the book of Daniel, you see a vision or dream that Daniel has that is sort of an interesting dream, because he sees these beasts here that are reproduced here. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Now that's important, because we're going to talk about the sea in Revelation 13. He said, the winds were stirring up this great sea, and 4 beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, had eagle's wings. I watched, its wings were plucked. Or I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Suddenly, another beast, a second, like a bear. Then you drop down to verse 6, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on his back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a 4th speaking pompous words. Now, does that sound kind of like what you read in the book of Revelation, doesn't it? I mean, just kind of the similar imagery there. And then we see in verse 13, on through verses 13 and 14, some other events that are going to take place there that I think are parallel with back with what happened in Daniel 2. Now, Daniel was grieved, but he was told the interpretation of these. He said in verse 17, these great beasts, which are 4 kings which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. So what 4 kingdoms do you think he saw here? He saw the same 4 kingdoms that he saw in the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had. He saw if I get this to come up on me, Tim, I think my battery's dead or something. But he saw the kingdom of Babylon as the lion. He saw the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians as the leopard. Then he saw the Grecian kingdom, and then he saw this dreaded beast that he could not describe as the Roman Empire. And I don't know why this thing is not letting me advance. But anyway, I was going to show you. Tim's doing something. There we go. And these are what those images represented. But then as we get into Revelation 13 and Daniel 7, you see that the beasts, I believe, in both instances, represent Rome. And so that's why I am very confident that what John is talking about here is the persecuting powers of Rome. Rome is going to try to stamp out Christianity. Rome is going to try to annihilate the saints. Rome is going to try to destroy what Jesus established, but the saints are going to prevail. Now, when you see a comparison, you see the symbols that are the same in Daniel and Revelation. A beast with 10 horns. The beast is a world kingdom. It prevailed in the war with the saints. It had power. The power was limited, rather, to times and a half a time, which is 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. But the kingdom of God stands. The saints possess the kingdom. They overcome, and the beast is defeated. And so that's why I believe that what you're looking at in the book of Revelation is the persecuting power of Rome that was happening at that particular time, coming upon those Christians, and they needed some comfort and they needed some hope. How are we going to endure this, man? It's hard for us to stand against Rome. Now, Irenaeus, who lived in 120 to 202 A.D., who was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a man who knew John personally. Irenaeus wrote of John receiving the vision of Revelation. He said, "For that was seen not very long since, but almost in our own day, toward the end of Domitian's reign." And so you got to understand the time setting in which this was occurring. It was during the reign of Emperor Domitian, when there was severe persecution that was beginning to come upon the Christians. And I'm going to stop right here because you don't want to. I really want to cover this chart in more detail. But does anybody have anything you want to bring up? I'm sorry, Mo. This side's been awfully quiet. I've just been ignoring you guys.